Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest in today's show is Paul G. Buckner. He's a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a professional musician, an avid outdoorsman, and an award-winning Amazon top-selling author. I'll be talking with him from his home in Oklahoma about his book, Bigfoot, UFOs, and the Paranormal True Encounters. Paul G. Buckner, Dida Ni Lusty. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Stan, thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to this.
You grew up in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains, and as a young boy, spent many summers in the woods or in the lakes, creeks, and rivers, hunting and fishing and camping. How did that experience, being connected so strongly to nature in your formative years, affect you as a person? And do you feel it had any influence on your writing?
I think we grew up in an era where being outdoors was it was just a common thing for kids. And I lived in a small community out of the country, and right near just less than a mile away from the Evansville Creek, which is a pretty good little creek size there. And we would camp out there as kids by ourselves. We didn't have adult supervision outside like that. We were pretty much allowed to run free and experience life. And I think that had a profound impact on the way that I look at nature, the things that I see and experience and know firsthand instead of just reading about it in a book. I grew up basically living in the woods, especially during the summers. A lot of times, us boys would go out to the creek or near the lake or somewhere, and we would camp for days at a time. The parents would come out every now and then to check on us just to make sure we were still alive. It was a great time growing up. We saw a lot of things, got to experience a lot of things. They don't have that experience and they don't have that appreciation for nature.
Many of your stories have been passed down through several generations orally in accordance with Cherokee tradition, as well as in your travels throughout the U.S., where you interviewed firsthand witnesses to a wide range of paranormal encounters, some of which we'll be covering in this interview. Out of curiosity, I was wondering, Paul, what was your first experience encountering a Bigfoot type creature? How old were you? Where did you see it? And what was your initial reaction to that encounter?
To be honest, the first experience that I had was not one of my own. It was my aunt's. And we were, I guess this was in the late 70s, early 80s. I think around 78, 79. What had happened was me and my cousin were with our dads. They were worked in construction, and this is during the summertime. And back then, this was before cell phones. Neighbors knew neighbors. Well, my uncle and my dad were working on this house, and we were with them. My cousin and I, we were about 11 years old. We were just playing out there while they were working on the house in construction. A neighbor came over and asked where our dads were. And we told him they were inside the house doing some work in there. So he ran inside. Whatever he told him, he brought both of our dads out on the run, basically said, "Get in the truck. We got to go home." So my cousin and I, we jumped in the back of the truck and we took off because my Uncle Alan's wife had called the neighbor and asked for him to tell Alan to come home right away. She was scared. We got there in about 20 minutes. That's how far away we were working. When we pulled up to the house was locked up, tight as a drum. Alan's fumbling for his keys, and he finally gets the keys open and stuff. And we all go into the house. My aunt and her daughter, just a young girl at that time, maybe 5 or 6, they were hiding in the back room. She is just scared to death. I mean, she is shaking. She's crying, very upset. She tells my uncle and my dad what had happened. And she was outside hanging up laundry. And where they live, it's kind of on top of a hill. There's pastures around because it's a farm. On the backside of the pasture, it kind of tapers off into the tree line. And where she was at in the back of the house, she was hanging up the laundry, and she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, slowly walking up the hillside. Now it's far enough away that she didn't really know what it was. She said she thought it was a cow at first because there's cows out there in those pastures. She kept noticing, and it would just stand there, and it was just this dark blob basically on the horizon there. It would get larger because she knew it was coming toward her. So she thought it was a cow for the longest time. And then she bent down to pick something up. And as she did this, she saw it move, but instead of coming straight, it kind of paralleled her. And she saw that it was walking upright. So she got to looking at it really close. Is this a farmer or something? Maybe had lost a cow and was trying to find it or something, because there wasn't very many houses around there close by. She was really looking at it closely, and it stopped and started coming toward her again. And this dark figure, it looked like it was completely covered in black fur or hair. I just got into a panic mode. She scared. I don't know if she screamed or anything like that. She may have. She doesn't remember. But she ran into the house and grabbed her daughter. They looked out the window again. The creatures even closer to the house, but walking now toward their barn. Their barn, they had some bottle calves out there and a small corral. She was watching this, and she was just scared, just shaking scared. It grabbed one of the calves. I don't know if it took off with it or not. And that's when she said it turned and looked at her. That really scared her, and they had all the doors locked, and they ran to the back bedroom, and that's when they called the neighbor to come and get her husband, Uncle Alan, to come home right away and see what's going on. So when we get there and she tells us all this, of course, my dad and my uncle, they grab a couple of shotguns and they go outside to the barn, and me and my cousin are right there with them. And they're looking around, and they don't see any fences that are broken or anything like that. But she said it stepped over fence. Whatever it was really huge, and it stepped over the top of the fence. And I remember being only 11 years old or something. When we went over that fence, my cousin and I, we climbed over it. It was like a 3-rail wooden post fence. So we climbed over that to get to the other side. It's a good step. But when we got inside the barn, sure enough, one of the calves was missing. From there, we started looking around, and we went to the woods, and we searched and searched, never found anything, never saw anything like that again. And that was really my first experience. My aunt wanted to move away from there very quickly. I think they were probably had moved within the next couple of years. That's how scared she was. That was my first real experience with Bigfoot. I think that was one of the things that just really intrigued me, that got me just into this. I'm just fascinated with these stories of Bigfoot because I know my aunt very well. This is not something that she could have just made up on her own. And I don't think she is that type of person. She's a full-blood Cherokee. And she was just very adamant about this. That was the first thing that really got me interested in following this phenomenon.
What an experience. Wow. While we're on the subject of Bigfoot-type creatures, can you, Paul, share some stories of these creatures you obtained from eyewitnesses to the encounters who you personally spoke with, as well as from those that were related to you, which had their roots in legends passed on by ancestors?
That's one of the things that I've really been trying to do a lot more research on. James Mooney, back in the 1800s, and he lived with the Cherokee for quite some time to study them. He was kind of a self-proclaimed sociologist, anthropologist, that type of person. He's a very studious man, and he really did a lot of research being embedded with the tribe. He collected a lot of different stories, a lot of different legends. The book is entitled Myths and Formulas of the Cherokee by James Mooney. One of the stories in particular is one that runs very parallel to everything that is pretty much testified about today when somebody has a Bigfoot encounter. The story involves a hairy giant with a sloped forehead who is a great hunter. As that story is told, he is a great hunter that winds up wedding a young Cherokee maiden. And during his courtship, the maiden mother wanted to meet her new beau. The girl asked her new boyfriend if he would mind meeting her mother first. He said, well, okay, but here's the deal. To paraphrase this, That's not a problem. We can do that first thing. But if she screams out in panic or is scared of me or in any way like that, I'm leaving and I won't return. To see that she won't see him again. We'll never see him. So the next morning when they wake up and the sun comes up and the mother comes to meet him, she lets out a scream. She panics because he's so big and ugly and just ferocious looking. The hunter says, okay, she's never going to see me again. So the story continues along, very much akin to that. He allows the young maiden to see him. But if he chooses for somebody not to see him, then they will not see him. He may choose for him to let him hear them coming or something, but then they're to avert their eyes. So there's a lot of different tales about that, but it runs very similar to the stories that we hear about Bigfoot. Some of the things that are a common trait that a lot of people say, well, if Bigfoot wants you to see them, they will let you see them. Well, that's pretty much the way it is in the story. And if he wants you to hear them, you can hear them. There's a lot of parallels with that particular story. But from all the elders that I've spoken with, that particular story, a couple of things to keep in mind. There's no way to confirm whether or not this story was told as entertainment, because the Cherokee people love to laugh. That's just part of our culture. We tell a lot of stories purely for entertainment. But we also tell a lot of stories too, especially about the creation stories and stuff, to teach kids lessons about our environment. How do we interact with the environment and the ways that we should treat others and that sort of thing. So you have to take a lot of these things into account when you're hearing some of these older, this lore, these legends, these stories that are passed down. And you know as well as I do that from the telling of a story by one person, passing it down to the next, that story changes, it transforms, it evolves into a lot of different things. So how much has that story evolved before it got to him? And then how is it really passed down again today? But the thing about that is, like I said, I've spoken with a lot of different elders and a lot of different people that they don't tell those old stories like that. They just don't. Within the Cherokee Nation tribe, we have what we call the national treasures. And the national treasures are those that basically keep the culture alive and pass that on down. And one of those national treasures are storytellers. So it's a very important part of the tribe because, as you know, most Native American tribes, especially us, we're a very oral tradition tribe. So everything is passed down orally. How do those stories evolve? What do they become? And what are the moral of the story? A lot of different things to consider.
Yes, it is fascinating. Are you aware, Paul, of any origin stories about Bigfoot type creatures, such as when, where, and how they came to be? And would you know or care to speculate as to why they've chosen to distance themselves, for the most part, from humans?
There's a couple of different stories and a couple of different outlooks on that from the Cherokee Nation perspective, anyway. One of them has to do with spirit people. And there's a lot of different spirit people within the Cherokee lore, from Deer Lady to the Little People. And one of the stories is about a spirit people, a warrior-like people that is very helpful to lost hunters in the woods. And they would show themselves to them and help people that may have lost their way to guide them back home, which is very similar to what the stories about the little people are as well. These are all spirit beings, and they live not just on our level, but on the upper plane and the lower planes. They can work within those planes, depending on what they want to come of this. One story in particular was a lost boy that was out in the woods and he got lost, turned around, couldn't find his way back home. When he encounters this old elderly gentleman, and he said, well, why don't you come back with me? We'll feed you a good meal, and then I'll bring you home in the morning. So the boy goes with him, and he meets this elder's family. They're having dinner, and then he goes outside and he plays with the kids and stuff. Another man comes along from his village from the boy's village that he knew. So he was made very comfortable. Didn't feel scared. He felt very comfortable meeting this guy from his own village. And they have a good evening. They tell stories by the fire, and after they eat, they all go to bed. The next morning, the elder gentleman that brought him back home to meet his family and feed him and all that did as he promised, and he's took him home. Well, along the way, they come to the river where the boy had gotten lost at first. The guy tells him, just go follow this path right here, and you're going to come to the road. And when you find the road, you're going to follow that back to your village. The boy says, okay, thanks a lot for everything, and bye, I'll see you later. He starts walking off down this path, and he turns around and look. There is no path behind him any longer. There is no elderly gentleman there. It's just woods and trees and brush. There's nothing there except for the path in front of him. He just accepts it for what it is, and he goes back to the village. And the village comes out. Somebody cries out, there he is. We found him. They ask him, well, where have you been? And he tells them the story about this old man that had found him out there and that had taken him back there. And about that time, the whole village is out there because they had been looking for him and hearing his story. The old man that had come to that camp shows up, and he says, well, he was there. He can tell you. And he says, well, I was never there. I've never left the village. There's a lot of stories like that about lost hunters or lost hikers, lost people like that are helped out by a perfect stranger. It could be the spirit people. And the little people legends are very much run like that too.
From just about everything I read and hear about Bigfoot, Sasquatch creatures, it appears their choice of habitat are dense forests. Have they ever been found in other types of environments to which they've adapted?
That is a question that I have really asked around a lot about, because during my travels as a musician, I have been to at least 40 different states. Most of the tribal members that I've talked to, it's very much like that. It's very much in the dense woods, or very much way out away from civilization, where all these stories seem to take place. And I've never encountered anything with a Bigfoot or Sasquatch type being in any urban area, because that's something I think is kind of fascinating, because I do hear a lot of stories that attach Bigfoot to the supernatural. Well, the supernatural doesn't just live out in the woods either. So the supernatural, it seems to be everywhere, the paranormal everywhere. So why is Bigfoot just isolated only to the dense forest? As of yet, that's the only eyewitness encounters that I've spoken with.
Have you, Paul, in your travels and research, been able to obtain any documented evidence that proves the existence of Bigfoot, Sasquatch type creatures? If so, can you share it?
I don't have any proof. I've had a couple of encounters that I've experienced myself, which lead me to have a very strong belief that there is something out there. I believe that it's a flesh and blood creature. One of the things that I saw, and also had a collaboration witness with this too, was I was driving home late one night. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I was coming down this area known as Eldon Hill. It's an isolated out in the country setting. And as I come down the bottom of this hill, you pass by Barren Fork Creek. As I was going over the bridge, the road starts getting back. It's just a slow, gradual turn. As I come up on that curve, something on the side of the road was sitting down there. It looked like a person. As I'm coming up to it, my headlights are shining on it, but it's very dark. It's a dark person, like they're wearing dark clothes or something. But as I get closer to it, it stands like from just a seated position, just stands right up. And as it stands up, it just seems to keep getting taller and taller. And as I get to it, my eyes are just wide open now. I'm just staring straight at it. It just steps around behind a tree and then disappears into the wood. A few days later, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he told me a very similar story. They were coming home late one night. They saw something at the bottom of the hill cross the road in front of them, and he swears it was a Bigfoot. And then I told him about my encounter, and it was within a mile of the same place. That was very interesting to me. And I really wanted to go out there and search that particular area. And we did maybe a few months later, but we never encountered anything there again. The second encounter, I didn't actually see it. But what had happened was we were in Honubby Creek. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Honubby Creek, but they have a huge Bigfoot festival there every year, held in October, actually. I used to go down there before they started having this festival. I've got friends that have cabins down there, and it's a big area. It's a wildlife management area, over 100,000 acres in just one area there. And there's a couple of rivers that run through there. Well, years and years ago, there was a story that came out about a Bigfoot attack on some hunters in a cabin. And that's what kind of put Honubby Creek on the map, so to speak. One night, I was to meet some friends at the cabin there, and the cabin is up on top of this mountain. To get to the cabin, you turn off the road, which is a nice paved road. You turn off that onto this old logging trail, because those mountains are just full of logging trails, because that's what they did there. And you follow this logging trail back a couple of miles into the woods to get to his cabin, and it just winds around. I mean, there's some hairpin curves in there to get around trees and stumps and all this, and it's very rugged. I was to meet them there that night. They had left Tulsa, and I had left Stillwell. And, I got there before them, and there is absolutely no cell phone reception whatsoever up there. So I get there and I get down to the cabin, and I finally get the trailer backed into the cabin there, and I'm just sitting there waiting, and it's starting to get dark. Well, as it gets dark up there, it is dark. I mean, pitch black dark. There's no light. There's no moon. There's no stars. No artificial light out there at all until we get to the cabin and get the generators turned on and all of that. So it is pitch black. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. So I'm sitting there, and it's late summer, early fall, and I've got my windows down. And when I first killed the engine on the truck, the radio stays on, the dash lights and everything stay on for about 10 minutes, then they go off. Well, I'm sitting there listening to the radio, and then it goes off and it dies, and that just pitches me right into the darkness. Then all of a sudden, I'm sitting here. I got my arm on the window like this, and I'm trying to catch some of that breeze. Both windows are down. I noticed then was all the sounds had stopped. There was nothing. There was no sound at all. Crickets had stopped. No more cicadas in the trees. No bullfrogs croaking. No owls hooting. Nothing. I mean, it was dead silent. So it kind of started making the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Then I hear that crunch again, but not just once, it's twice, like, so it's just right to the left of me, out to the side of my truck. And I'm really thinking, well, should I start my truck up and turn the lights on? I don't want to do that yet, because I'm thinking, well, maybe this is a dog. It could be a bear, because there's a lot of bears down there. Could be a cat even, but a cat would be a lot more quiet than what this was. I don't know, maybe it seemed like forever, another minute or so. Then I hear that step again, crunch, 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 crunch. It sounds like it's on 2 feet. Now, as a hunter, growing up in the woods and stuff, I can tell when an animal is walking on 4 legs or 2 legs. Whatever this was on 2 legs. And I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is one of the guys trying to scare me. They got here earlier, and they may have went on down further to the other cabin or something. So I'm just sitting there and really listening. And then all of a sudden, the open window in my door frame, you can tell when something or someone the entire window is now just blocked. Even though I was just in pitch darkness, there was nothing. It was something there covering the entire thing. And it was just looming over me. It was like hot and musky. And that's when I turned the truck on really quick, and I saw something. I don't remember what it was, but I remember starting the truck. The next thing I remember, I was sitting 3 miles away at the Honubby Creek store. I finally come to my senses, I guess. I'm sitting here looking around, and I'm thinking, wondering, how did I get here? I don't know what happened between that time and the time that I got there, because I had lost a couple of hours. My friends finally come by, and they said they had a flat tire that caused them to be a lot later than what they expected to be. This was 2 hours later from the time that I was supposed to meet them. What happened to all of that time? I just remember being scared, losing all that time. That was something I'll never forget. That it was just so profound.
UFOs, UAPs are a popular subject on Paranormal Yakker, and happily familiar my viewers, they are covered in your book. Can you all relate one or two of them?
One of the things that got me thinking about UFOs too, and this is some personal experiences. Obviously, I think that's where most of that interest comes from. But one time when I was a small boy, I was fishing with my mom and dad. I remember I got tired late that night, and I went and I sat down on the back tailgate of the pickup, and I'm just looking up at the stars, and I see this light. It flashes from one horizon to the other, just like it's skipping. It wasn't like a shooting star because it skipped across and stopped, skipped back, and then skipped back across to the other horizon, like in a matter of seconds. I just remember that was my first experience ever of seeing or hearing about a UFO. But later on, I had a real experience with a UFO that I saw firsthand. And what had happened, it was in a early winter, late fall. We were coming home, my wife and I at the time, we were coming home from Fort Smith, Arkansas. We had stopped in town when we got there to get gas in Stillwell. And this is about 11:30 at night. There's on like a Sunday night, there's nobody in town. There's just one small convenience store that was open. And it's starting to mist outside and it's a little bit chilly. Well, I stopped to fill up the tank and my wife goes inside to get something to drink. While I'm there putting the gas in, I'm just standing there and I hear this slow hum. I felt it more than see it. So I'm looking around thinking maybe there's a semi truck nearby that just started up or a dump truck or something like that, or maybe even a train. There's nothing anywhere around. I'm thinking, well, what in the world is that? Is there a generator on the stores? It started getting more intense and I could really feel it. And it just kind of reverberates through your chest. You know, it was that low. It had to be below 40 hertz because you couldn't really hear it, but you could feel it. I walked out from underneath the awning there where the gas pumps were. And I just happened to look up. And when I did, I saw this ship. It was very slowly hovering above us and was just moving off toward the northwest. I could see the bottom of it. This thing is huge. It covers the entire sky because all the street lights from the mist and everything were shining, and you could see the bottom of it. So it had to be 150 feet or less. It was huge, and it didn't have any lights on it. You could see that it was made out of some sort of a gray gunmetal type material, and it was moving so slow and it was so huge that it wasn't any kind of an airship or anything like that, but it just slowly moved off. As it was doing so, my wife comes out and she looks up and she sees it as well. So I knew I wasn't crazy, but it was huge. The next day, I asked around to a lot of different people. I tried to look at some newspapers and stuff. There was no reports of anything else from anybody like that. So very interesting.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yakker want to buy Bigfoot, UFOs, and the paranormal, true encounters, and also learn about other books you've authored, how, Paul, can they do that?
One of the things that I did first was I collected a lot of different stories from a lot of different people all around the country. And as I collected these stories, they really kind of inspired me to write. I love the nonfiction stories, anything to do with Bigfoot or UFOs or anything supernatural, paranormal. So one of the first books I wrote was titled Siege at Hawthorne Lake, Murder on the Mountain. One of the things I wanted to do with that book, and it's the first one in the series of the Hawthorne Lake series. What I wanted to do with that was to tell a story of Bigfoot that was not your typical everyday run-of-the-mill Bigfoot story. I wanted it to be more, I guess, mainline, more along the lines of I would say Stephen King, Dean Koontz, that type of novel. And had a lot of fun with that. I drew from a lot of different inspiring stories. That series continues on into the second book. the thing too that a lot of people, a lot of the fans of Bigfoot have asked me at different sightings and stuff. Well, how many people do you talk to, and what kind of stories are they telling you? And they're just really curious about all these different people that have had these encounters. That got me to follow another path of the nonfiction, and between the fiction and the nonfiction, I don't know which I like best, but the real stuff is, I mean, I love hearing the stories from real people that have real encounters because they have such an earnestness about them when they're telling these stories that just draws you right into it. And you're practically there with them. And that's what I love about this particular series here, Bigfoot, UFOs, and the Paranormal. These folks are real people, just your next door neighbors. The next one in that series, volume 2, I'm hoping to have release a date sometime late fall, early winter. There's some real intriguing stories there involving some a haunting and a UFO story that is just wow, just out of this world. Pardon the pun, but it really is. And that was from a pipeline welder up in Montana. Just a fascinating story there too. I think that's what is really drawing me in now is the real people telling the real stories, the real encounters. It's very much real to them.
Again, I want to make sure that people can order your book. So what is the contact information? How could they find out about it? Where can they order it?
Amazon.com. It's exclusive with them. And you can search for it by that book title, Bigfoot, UFOs, and the Paranormal, or by my name, Paul G. Buckner. And they will all come right up for you.
I want to make sure people are going to be able to order your books.
Yes.
Paul G. Buckner, Wado, thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. Yakking with you has been a most enjoyable experience.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I love sharing these stories.
Hi everyone, this is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.